What's good, everybody? Chris here again. Chris Goes Outdoors, and today we are doing video number 2 in my Appalachian Trail State Overview series. Video number 1 of Georgia was received very well. Thank you, everybody, for your likes and comments on that video. Greatly appreciated. I said if it was well received, I would make a follow-up. So here we are. We're going to do North Carolina. For anybody that did not watch the initial video, I'll leave a link up there so you can go check that out if you'd like. And in this series of videos, I'm going to go over essentially anything that I can remember from the Appalachian Trail in this state. So we're talking shelters, trail conditions, views, the towns I stayed in, people I remember, places I went, stories I can recall. Of course, I got my notes right here. So without further ado, let's jump right into North Carolina. Alright, so we crossed the border of Georgia and North Carolina. We are now in North Carolina. You passed the big funky tree from the last video you saw. So that night we stopped at Muskrat Creek Shelter, which was mile 81.4. And this is the shelter where I first met the one, the only, a Big Mammy. I remember specifically we got there, it was a pretty long day, I don't know how many miles, and went into the shelter area. We're looking around, a bunch of people were there. I think all of us in the trail family opted to just pitch tents or hammocks, whatever we had. And I was sitting on a log with Fudd, eating, cooked up our food, and we were talking to Spitfire, who was setting up her tent, and she recognized one of the girls there, who Big Mama was going by the name River at the time. So this is the first time I met her. She was sitting there as well. We were all just kind of chatting, whatever. Little did I know that we would become a BFFs. Who'd have thought we'd end up finishing the trail together? So as for the actual shelter itself, the shelter was pretty small. I think probably would fit maybe 6 to 8 people. And it had a little overhang, and I believe that there was a table under the overhang. I think there was a fire pit there too. Tenting in that area was sparse, to say the least. You could probably fit some more hammocks in there because most of the ground was not level. We fit a decent amount of people back there, but compared to some of the other tent sites and shelters on the Appalachian Trail, say in Georgia, the space here was a little bit more limited. We found out the next morning too, if you go down a little bit further on the trail, that there were a couple more spaces out there as well. Water here was more than ample. You actually cross it again on your way to the shelter. So the trail comes down and you go, it would be, I'm gonna call it trail east. You would go to the right where the trail down to the shelter is. You cross the water right there. And yeah, not a bad place. We stayed there that night, headed out pretty early the next morning. So shortly after you cross out of Muskrat Creek Shelter, you will pass a sign for the Chunky Gal Trail. That's all I have to say. I don't know anything about the actual trail, but it is what it is. Post at the sign because it's kind of comedic. Just mosey on along your way. So after the Chunky Gal Trail, you will go downhill a pretty decent amount, and you end up heading down to the parking area at Deep Gap. And right when you get to Deep Gap, you will then begin your ascent up to Standing Indian Mountain. So I remember specifically the elevation profile of this looks pretty gnarly, but I recall the climb was pretty easy. And I can't really say if that's because we, were fresh kind of out of the shelter that morning, but it's a steady elevation gain. I don't think it was anything crazy. You're not going like very, very upright. It was just a nice gradual elevation gain. From what I recall, there was no real view on top that I can remember anyway. I do remember that there was a ton of burnt forest up there because I believe right before we started in 2017, I think it was over the fall that year. Pretty crazy wildfires down there from what I recall. So we finished a 12.5 mile day there at mile 93.9, and that was the Deep Gap Shelter. We arrived at the shelter, just scoped it out a little bit. Pretty cool shelter, so the privy was right there. When you get to the shelter, fit about 8 people. I remember there were like 2 people just kicking it in there when we had arrived. It's got a little overhang as well with some benches around. I think there may have been a table in there too, if I recall correct. I do believe there was a fire ring as well. We opted not to stay in the shelter, so we just backtracked couple hundred feet. If you go back, there's tons of camping space. You actually pass it on the trail going toward the shelter, but we wanted to check the shelter out anyway just to see how it was. So we went back, set up camp in that little area. There's spots on the right and left hand side. We took up on the right hand side there, and water from there was a little bit of a distance. It wasn't too bad. So if you're going straight towards the shelter, it would be trail west to you, and you end up going downhill a decent way, not too bad though. The water was flowing very, very well. Yeah, nice little shelter. I remember it did rain that night. It was a little sun shower as the sun actually went down, and then it rained a little bit overnight, but I remember sleeping like a rock at that place. So we got up to leave the next morning, and I actually misspoke thinking that this was a view in Georgia in my Georgia video, but it was actually a view after Carter Gap. So you head down the trail, and there's a sign I recall on your right, and I think it says something like viewpoint this way or something. It's kind of vague from what I remember, but definitely check that view out. I remember going up there, and that was like one of my favorite views from the entire trail. And it's just off trail. It's not a lot by any stretch of the imagination. And I remember we went out and it looked almost like a painting. The way like the haze was in the morning, the way the sun was hitting, you could just see like rows and rows of mountains, and it was just awesome. It was an amazing, amazing view. So we moseyed on along that route, and I remember we were getting right toward Albert Mountain. There's a fire tower on there, and that is also mile 100. For, at least it was for us, I think it was mile 99.8 or something. We'll round it up, we'll call it 100. And I remember very specifically that mile right before you get to the top of Albert Mountain was pretty crazy. So I remember it was very, very steep. It reminded me very much so of my near and dear White Mountains. So just be ready for that. It's pretty legit elevation gain. But once you get to the top, you can kind of kick it a little bit and enjoy the view up there. So there's a pretty cool view right off ground level once you're on the top of Albert Mountain. But you could also climb to the top of the fire tower. Unfortunately, the actual like inside of the tower was closed, but you can get essentially to the top and just stand underneath the actual fire tower. We were pumped when we got up there, and there were a lot of people up there. From what I recall, there's also a road that goes up there, so you kind of like cross over the road a bunch of times. But man, it was nice. It was really cool. Bunch of us were up there. I'd have to say it was probably 20 people when we got up there, and everybody was just excited, you know? You made your first 100 miles. And for me, on the Appalachian Trail, I've talked about this in many of the videos I've made so far. State borders and 100-mile markers were just huge morale boosts for me. So it was awesome to have finally made the first 100 miles. And you did it. I'll get really excited. Took some pictures. Take a moment there, you know, pause, reflect. You just got to do it 21 more times and you'll be good to go. After the 100-mile marker, we made a pit stop at the Long Branch Shelter. We'll say to use the facilities. This shelter was pretty cool. I think we actually got water there as well. So I think the stream was running pretty good. The shelter's like brand new. It was beautiful. So very, very new. 2-floor shelter, tons of space in there. So could probably fit 12 to 14 easily. And it had an overhang as well. It had a table in there, so if you stay at the Long Branch Shelter, you'll do pretty well, I think. Had a nice little fire pit, and it also had a pretty decent view. I think that view may get covered up if there was leaf coverage, but either way, it was nice when we got there. After we rolled out of the Long Branch Shelter, we ended that night at Rock Gap. And at Rock Gap, the shelter itself was pretty nice. Most of the crew actually ended up staying in the actual shelter. I chose to pitch my tent outside, however, just because, again, Noro. I was like kind of done with staying in shelters at that point. Water was fairly close to the shelter, you know, relatively speaking, but I feel like at the end of the day, it felt like a pretty strenuous walk. You'll find at the end of the day, especially if you're really tired, that walking, even if it's an extra, like, I don't know, 100 feet to water, just, you know, can be like, ugh. Water was pretty close to the shelter, easy to get to. We just kicked it that night. Nothing too crazy happened there. So we headed out of a Rock Gap Shelter that next morning, and we went 4 miles down to Winding Stair Gap. So at Winding Stair Gap, or before you go down, I do remember that there were some pretty decent views off of the trail in that area. Again, you could see most of these because there was no leaf coverage. The views may be a little dispersed if you're going around sometime in the spring or when there's leaf coverage. To get down to Winding Stair Gap, 4 miles, we headed down there because we were planning to head to Franklin, North Carolina, and our intention was to stay at Gooder Grove Hostel. And we had read in the guidebook that Gooder Grove operated a shuttle between Winding Stair Gap, the parking area, and Franklin, North Carolina, their hostel. So we got down there, we planned our time in the morning to be down there right to match up with the shuttle, and we lucked out completely good. We got there, shuttle was sitting there waiting, so got in the shuttle. Half of us anyway, so 4 of us from the trail family decided to stay at Gooder Grove. Some of the others ended up staying at the Budget Inn. And Gooder Grove was a pretty cool place. The people there, super chill. A guy, Zen, I think was his name, or trail name. Obviously, I don't think his actual name was Zen. Operates the place, but just a very chill dude. Who would have thought with a trail name Zen? But as far as the hostel goes, it was pretty clean. There were 2 bathrooms. I believe there was one on the main floor, one in the downstairs area. Both were super clean from what I recall. They had plenty of linens and stuff you could use there. They would also do your laundry for you there. I definitely opted to do that. We stayed in the downstairs bunk room. There was, I don't know, maybe 10 or so bunks that I can remember. Good enough for a night's sleep. Plenty of charging ports down there. I remember that they had the power strips on like every outlet down there. And I'm pretty sure that they had some private rooms there as well. I did not look at any of them though. The bathrooms also had all sorts of toiletries and stuff in there, so anything you could essentially need. The kitchen you could use as well. Of course, they just asked that you clean up after yourself. They did have some things that you could buy from the fridge and freezer there. So they had some, you know, soda and stuff like that. Some frozen sandwiches and things in the freezer. And I'm pretty sure it was on an honor system. So yeah, just don't be a dink. So we stayed there that night and kind of explored Franklin, North Carolina. And Franklin was a cool town, but it was kind of split up. Gooder Grove would be right here, and then there were 2 other sections of town you'd want to stay in. Over here, or on the camera it'll be over here. So over here is like where the grocery store and some of the cooler brewery and stuff is. And then over here is where all the other stuff is. There's another brewery. The Budget Inn is somewhere like right here. Where you would want to go in the town, I feel like, is fairly split up. Gooder Grove was a fairly easy walk. There was a Dollar General and an Ingles store. That's actually where I chose to resupply. Full-blown grocery store and a Dollar General, so you should be good to go as far as groceries go. I also ate at a place called the Motor Car Grill right when we got there. That place was so good. Oh my god, it was phenomenal. I was looking at Google Maps when making this, and it doesn't appear that that place is open anymore. I could be wrong, but if it is, check it out when you get there. The place was wonderful. Outdoor 76 Outfitter is also very close to this area as well. From Motor Car Grill, it's probably like a 2-minute walk. And everyone's favorite spot, everybody's favorite spot in Franklin seemed to be the Lazy Hiker Brewery. It was just a very chill atmosphere. We got there on a pretty warm Saturday, so it was pretty busy. They had a like fenced off little porch area that you could hang out in and sit, and just a big open, you know, brewery kind of space you could hang out, drink beers in. The people there were super friendly. All the beers are named after like hiker related things for the most part. They did not serve food directly in the brewery, but outside in the parking area, you could just walk back and forth. They did have a food truck. The food there was pretty epic. I did not buy anything personally, but some hikers allowed me to sample the goods. Huge portions, very decently priced. They were delicious. The guy seemed to particularly enjoy the hiker folks, so shout out to him for hooking up the hungry, if you will. So that was the main area I stayed in. On the other side of town, down past the Budget Inn, there was, as I recall, a McDonald's, a Domino's, and then the brewery, the Kerry Brewery. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Only reason I went over there, not gonna lie, a huge group of people were going from Lazy Hiker to Kerry. My party days are well behind me at this point, so I was like, I'm done with that. So I acted like I was gonna go, walked with everyone, and I just went to McDonald's. So that was my entire plan. I just wanted to grab some McDoubles. So got some hamburgers, and I was like, yeah, see you guys later. And they were like, oh no. So if you're trying to avoid the party scene, it's pretty easy to do, so just duck out and get burgers. I did hear that the Kerry Brewery was actually pretty good spot. All in all, Franklin was a cool town, definitely has all sorts of stuff that you could need. The outfitter there, I did not go into, but heard good things about. I think it was Outdoor 76 that had, I think they call him the Shoe Doctor. Apparently you can go in there, and I think it's Outdoor 76. If I'm naming the wrong outfitter, I apologize. You'll go in there and the guy will spend like an hour with you, like going over like your feet and like trying to like get everything perfect. From what I recall, Big Mama went there, and that's where she got her North Face shoes that ended up being the shoes she wore all through her entire hike. So I may be wrong with that. I'll try to find more information on that. I'll try to ask Big Mama if that's where she went, and if it is, I'll leave a little note right on me right here, because it'll probably be easiest to read there. We stayed at Gooder Grove. They ended up shuttling us back the next day. I think we failed to realize first thing in the morning, it happened to have been Easter Sunday that morning. We got up and we're like, yeah, let's grab breakfast before we get back to the trail, and the guy Zen actually offered to drive us into town to try to get something to eat. Nothing was open. It was Easter Sunday, so we were like, oh, wonderful. Completely forgot about that. So we ended up just going back to the trail that morning. Unfortunately, no breakfast to be had. So he drove us back to Winding Stair Gap. So back at Winding Stair Gap, you immediately go up to Seiler Bald. I don't remember anything overly difficult about going up there. Again, maybe it was just because we were fresh out of town, whatever, but I don't remember anything about the climb being too difficult. However, after that, Wyabald, I do remember being a little bit more challenging. And I think part of that was I was just really pushing to kind of get up there. I forget why exactly. I don't forget why. There was a bathroom on top. So yeah, there's once you get to the top of Wyabald, you'll come out to a road, or I'm pretty sure it was like a parking area. And to your right, if you go right, there's a little parking area for maybe 8 cars or so, and there's a like big outhouse building there, so that's why I was heading up there so quick. Stopped in there. Great facilities, by the way. So after that, I went back out and headed up what would have been trail west or left when you got out to the trail, and that will bring you to the fire tower and where the actual trail is. When we got up there, that whole area was torched from those fires. And the actual fire tower itself, from what I was told, used to have a big roof on it, big wooden roof. Whole thing was burnt off. I don't know if they have since fixed that. The actual fire tower up there had a very, very nice view. And then the actual trail continues, it's kind of like behind the tower. You'll see it once you get up there. And that night we stayed around mile 120, 121, and that was the Wyabald shelter. It did have another overhang. It was a single floor shelter, would probably fit about 8 people. I did not, again, stay in the shelter. I opted to stay in my tent. There were very limited tent sites right at the shelter there, so keep that in mind. Most of our trail family stayed in the shelter. I think we were the only ones there that night. Limited tenting space at that shelter, or so we thought. The next morning we ended up walking down the trail, and we ended up seeing a couple more tent sites along the trail, so keep that in mind. If you get there and it's full, walk a little bit more, you'll find some more space. I remember water was not too far from the trail. I'm pretty sure, again, once you go past the shelter, like so you're going down the trail, I think the shelter was on the right, you'll continue down just a little and it veers off to the left and you go down, the water's down that area. So it was easy to get, flowing really, really good. A nice little shelter. I remember that night specifically because Fudd brought some marshmallows. I forget why, I forget his reasoning for bringing them, but he stopped at the grocery store or whatever, bought a huge bag of marshmallows. So everybody there was eating marshmallows. So the next day we moseyed out onto the trail, and I remember walking by the Cold Spring Shelter, or as I called it, one of the most convenient shelters on the Appalachian Trail. The shelter is directly on the trail, so you have to walk around the shelter to continue on the trail. So the shelter's here. The spring's 20 feet, I think, from the shelter, coming out of a rock, like just leaking straight out of a rock. The privy was about 100 feet downhill from there, and there was a huge little tent site area just above the shelter. Everything you need from that shelter is within, a couple 100 feet of each other, so it was great. Super convenient shelter. Unfortunately, we did not stay there, but we didn't have to go far off trail to sit down and enjoy a quick little snack. After Cold Spring, I believe it was 0.1 mile side trail to Rocky Bald. I think a lot of people pass this one up. They say, 0.1, whatever, I'm gonna keep going. Don't pass it up. And it says 0.1, but I think it's even less than that. It's just a couple feet, it felt like. We went down there and it was a beautiful, beautiful view. So definitely check that one out for sure. Don't skip the Rocky Bald view. So after Rocky Bald, we continued on our way, a fairly easy climb up Wesserbald. And on top of Wesserbald, there was a pretty legit fire tower, or I think they call it an observation tower up there. So we opted to check that out. I was with myself, Fudd, and a gentleman named Scallywag, who I believe was doing the entire Eastern Continental Trail. And I think he made it. I'm not exactly sure or positive, but I remember being up there with them and we were just kind of enjoying the view. There was some day hikers up there who were super kind to us, just talking to us, whatever. They had some extra food. They had some, what are those mini oranges? What are those things called? Clementines, I think it was. So they gave us each a couple of them. They had some leftover cookies, so shout out to them. You guys fueled us on our the rest of our day, I suppose. So yeah, a beautiful, beautiful view on top of that observation tower. Complete 360 view around you, and it was gorgeous. So nice little view of North Carolina and Georgia. I assume you can probably see Georgia still from there. So definitely a beautiful view up there. Definitely check out the observation tower. From the top of Western Bald, you essentially head right downhill. We headed down to the Rufus A. Morgan Shelter. The plan that day was to attempt to get to the NOC. However, just wasn't feeling it. We got to the Rufus A. Morgan Shelter. I never actually went up to the shelter area itself. I could see it in the distance from where we were, but I had no intention on staying in the shelter, so I didn't even go to look for it. But I guess that there was a privy up there. The shelter itself was there. Me and Big Mama actually ended up staying at this spot, so right on the trail, like the trail passes, there's a ton of flat area off to, it'll be Trail West. We just pitched our tents right there, and the water kind of runs along that area. So water was plentiful and easy to get right there. Some bad weather ended up moving in. The rest of the trail family headed down to the NOC where there was a hostel, so they all stayed at the hostel that night. And again, me and Big Mama just decided to stay in our tents that evening. It poured that night, I remember very, very clearly. It rained pretty hard and was still raining the next morning when we woke up. Unfortunately, packed up in the rain and walked down to the NOC in the rain as well. So you'll come down to the NOC. Cool little area. Supposedly there's all sorts of stuff you can do there. There's like whitewater rafting. There's a restaurant and outfitter. So I got down there first. I didn't know where the trail family was. No service down there at the time. Big Mama ended up coming. I was just essentially waiting for her to show up. And at that time, I ended up finding the trail family. They were in what was called River's End, so it was just a little eatery there. They were serving breakfast at the time. Apparently they do lunch and dinner, but there's also a little general store down at the NOC. You can get, little snacks and stuff. I don't know how expensive it was. I think it was closed when we get down there. There's also a public bathroom that you can use as well. We went to the breakfast place there, and then we're waiting for the actual NOC outfitter to open. I forget, Big Mama needed something. I forget what it was, but we also wanted to print our Smokies permits and heard that you could do it here. And this was a super easy place to print it. I don't even think they charged for it. I'm pretty sure it was just set up for anybody to use. They have a little computer kiosk in the corner of the store and you can print your permit right there. Definitely check out the outfitter at NOC for your permit. There is one other place you can print it that I know of anyway, and we'll talk about that a little later on in the video. Out of the NOC, you head up a fairly steep climb, or at least it was steep from what I remember. It might have just been because I was annoyed and wet, but we ended up heading up to the Sassafras Gap Shelter after that, and there were some pretty cool views off of the trail heading up that way as well, even in like the fog and rain that we were in. I remember one in particular, the clouds were like below us and like you could see another mountaintop or another hill, whatever it was in the distance. And that was, I feel like, right before the shelter. So we ended up getting to the shelter, and the shelter was huge. The trail is kind of up above the shelter and you have to go down into the shelter area. The shelter is 2 floors, and it fit probably 14 or more hikers in there. Because it was pouring rain, everybody was trying to get out of the rain. Luckily, there was also a huge overhang, so people were able to kind of, take cover from the rain, take their wet stuff off, hang it up around the area. People were all hanging around, cooking up their meals and stuff under the overhang. It was super, super crowded, I do remember that. All in all, it wasn't too bad considering the weather. We did cram a lot of people in there. We planned to head on from there, but where the weather was bad, we were just like, whatever, we're done. So called it an early day there. Water is very, very close to the shelter. Won't have to worry about that. I don't think it was flowing great when we were there. The privy also just a little bit away, so not bad at all. Camping spots as far as Sassafras Gap Shelter, very, very limited. So I think 1 or 2 that I can recall that would be, suitable for decent camping. You probably get away with a hammock much easier there. But if you're trying to actually camp in a tent there, instead of going down to where the shelter is, back up, where the trail kind of loops around the shelter, there were a couple spots up on the trail up there. Maybe keep that in mind if you are trying to, in fact, tent up there. So out of Sassafras Gap, I do remember it was seemingly fairly easy day. I think it was 15 miles. We made it to Cable Gap Shelter, even though at Sassafras there was some super miserable guy there who insisted that we would never make it. I remember specifically at the end when we got there being like, hey, remember that guy who said we wouldn't make it here? But we made it. We made it with time to spare. Plenty of time to spare. Still sun in the sky. You cross water literally as you're walking to the shelter. So water's right there. It was plentiful. The actual shelter itself was pretty small. I think it only fits 6 people, but where the shelter is, if you keep walking past the shelter, there's all sorts of like random camp spots along that area, and it goes back for a pretty long distance. So I just opted to pitch my tent there. I just went to my tent and hung out. You know, I just wanted some alone time, edited some videos, but I remember everybody seemed to have been up at the shelter chatting away and hanging out and whatnot. I have a video too. I briefly went back up there. They were trying to teach Big Mama to whistle, and I still don't think to this day she can whistle. She tried really hard though. I'll give her that. So out of the Cable Gap Shelter, we headed down toward Fontana Dam. When you come out of the trail here, you end up at a big parking area. It looks like a boat launching area too. So there's a little, I think it was a bathroom and just like an information center when you come up. And it has a phone on there, and supposedly you can dial the phone and request that the shuttle from Fontana Village comes and gets you. When we got there, we did not actually make the call. Somebody apparently already did, because almost right when we arrived, the shuttle came like a minute later. So you have a couple options here. You can get in the shuttle, and that will bring you to Fontana Village, where you can resupply. There's a post office, laundry, there's a place you can stay, the lodge there, a couple other things, eateries, stuff like that. You can opt to stay at what is referred to as the Fontana Hilton, which is just it's a fancier shelter than the normal shelters. You will see out on the Appalachian Trail, there's like solar showers, or maybe it was actual showers in a building next to it. I never actually went into the Fontana Hilton. I took a picture of it from afar. It just looks like a nicer shelter. Or you could just keep going on the trail, and you'd end up in the Smokies. Most of the trail family, everybody except Fudd and I, decided to stay at the Fontana Hilton that night. Fudd and I decided to hop into the shuttle and head into Fontana Village. So we ended up staying at Fontana Village. So me and Fudd went there, got a room at the lodge, and the place itself was nice, super rustic, and it had a beautiful view off of it. You could see from the lodge. There was a pool there, which unfortunately was opening just a couple days after we were there. Reasonably priced. I think we paid 50 or 60 bucks each, but it was probably the nicest place that we stayed on the entire trail. The rooms were immaculate. The beds were super comfortable. The bathroom was stunning. It was absolutely beautiful. It had one of those lamps you can turn on when you get out of the shower, and it's just hot and you can stand under and feel wonderful. That's a rarity. That's a rarity on the Appalachian Trail. There was one other place I think that had a heat lamp. The only issue with our room in particular was that the internet, the Wi-Fi there was pretty terrible. So we ended up spending a decent amount of time just up in the lobby there. The lobby was beautiful, really nice, comfortable couches and stuff. Besides the actual lodge there, within very easy walking distance, there was a restaurant that was also pretty reasonably priced, and they had great food. The entire trail family ended up, I think, shuttling from the Hilton over to the actual village and ended up eating with us there. I remember a couple of them had to pick up boxes at the post office too. So then just around the corner from where the eatery was, there is a big long building. It's got the laundromat right here, a general store, and the post office. So it's all in that like stretch of building. So Fudd and I resupplied, did our laundry, and just hung out right down that area. A lot of people opt to send a resupply box here. They're told that the resupply is extremely expensive in the general store there. I would argue that is not the case. Is it more expensive than other places? Yes, for sure. But Fudd and I resupplied for whatever it was until we ended up in Gatlinburg next. Ugh. We'll talk about that soon. But Fudd and I resupplied, and it really wasn't that expensive. I mean, for whatever it was, 5 or 6 days of food I bought, I think I ended up paying maybe like $15 more than I usually would. So if you factor in like sending a resupply box, the cost of shipping one of them, like $18 for a priority box, kind of evens out, and you can pick whatever you want too. So they had a huge selection there. And in my opinion, the prices were not much higher than you would have paid elsewhere. Like, were there, markups on things? Of course, because they're in like the middle of nowhere. But I feel like people were very dramatic about how much more expensive it was. They had Mountain House meals there for like $6 or $7 compared to $9 or $10 that you would pay at Outfitters and stuff. Consider just resupplying there. If you're buying the standard hiker fare, it really wasn't that expensive. Your results may vary, but I don't know, for us, it worked out. Would recommend staying there. So, really cool place if you got some extra money and are looking to kind of splurge a little bit on the trail. Keep an eye out for the Fontana Village there, the Fontana Lodge, or the Lodge at Fontana Village, whatever they call it. Was a nice place to go. So, and one more thing about the Fontana Village, the Fontana Lodge in particular, The lodge also had a computer and printer available, so that if you did not print your Smokies permit yet, you could still print it, because to the best of my knowledge, it is the last place available to print your permit before you enter the Smokies. You enter the Smokies right after you pass Fontana Dam. So I don't know if you have to be a guest to print it. I would assume that you do, but another option if you have not printed your permit yet. So the next morning, Fudd and I took the shuttle back to the same spot, the little parking area, boat launching area. We made our way down the trail and we just walked down to the actual dam. That area is pretty beautiful, so it's obviously a fairly level walk. On the dam itself, the views are really nice and it's just a cool area. We spent a lot of time zigzagging back and forth on each side, checking out the views. And once you get over the actual dam itself, that is where you enter the great Smoky Mountains. You come to a sign, it'll be on your right. You go past that. Me and Fudd for a little while thought we may have been on the wrong area, because you do kind of a pretty long road walk up to the actual entrance that you're looking for, but eventually you'll find it. It is a fairly longish road walk. There's a sign that says, pointing this way, and you'll see a Smokies permit box. So you're supposed to keep part of your permit with you and then deposit the other part in the box. Make sure you do that when you get into the Smokies, and just keep the other part on you. We were asked for it actually once while we were in the actual park. If we didn't have it, I don't know, maybe something would have happened. I don't know. Keep the permit with you, get your permit, and don't be that guy. Respect the trail. So respect the parks, that you're going in. After the long road walk, we made it to the Smokies, and the first cool thing that I remember in the Smokies was Shuckstack Fire Tower, which is at mile 170.8, and it's a very short off trail. So you walk up and the trail curves down this way, but the fire tower is this way, and you can see the fire tower. So very, very short walk, but that had an epic view on top of it, and you can actually go into like the actual fire tower itself, not just climb the tower, but you can look back down onto Fontana Dam where you just were, and it's kind of brings things to scale. It's pretty cool, so definitely check out that view. We made a pit stop also at Molly's Ridge Shelter. That was mile 177.3. That shelter was pretty big. It would probably fit like 12 or so people, and we made the pit stop there because it looked like weather was coming, and I needed to get water too. I think one or two others did. So the shelter, when you get there, you're walking on the trail. Shelter will be on your left. The trail keeps going this way. The water is also on the left, but you have to go pretty far downhill to get it. So a couple of us refilled, and right as I got back up, it started to pour. There was an overhang in the shelter, so we all just kind of hung out there. I made a quick meal while we were sitting there. A couple of us ate, and we were just chatting a little bit because it looked like the weather was going to pass. Luckily it did. So looked like a pretty cool shelter, but there was another one a little ways down, and we just opted to push on to get to that next shelter because that's where we planned on heading. So we hiked on 3 more miles, made it to the Russell Field Shelter. The shelter itself was packed, absolutely packed. A lot of people camping or staying the night at this shelter. We met the Ridge Runner Master Splinter there. Little did I know I would run into him again at Pennsylvania and New Jersey right before the border. Where the shelter itself was packed that night, in the Smokies, you're supposed to stay in the shelters unless, of course, they are overcrowded, in which case you are technically allowed to pitch your tents out in front of the shelter, and there were a bunch of us that did. There were probably 6 or so tents, and we were all kind of on top of each other, but I remember it poured that night. But all was well, we made it through the night. One of the more interesting things I found in the Smokies, most of the places I've gone to, and most of the places along the Appalachian Trail have some sort of privy, be it a composting privy, a pit privy, something like that. The Smokies on the Appalachian Trail, the shelters did not seem to opt for this, and I don't know the reasoning why. Maybe someone else does. I know that privies are more difficult to maintain, but instead the Smokies opt for, we'll just call it a poop field. So there's a designated area off the side of the shelter, you walk down to, and it's just a big area, and there's a shovel at each shelter, and you're just supposed to dig a cat hole and poop out in the field. Does it work? I suppose. Does everybody actually dig a hole? Nope. Is it dangerous walking through in the day, never mind at night? Absolutely. Not the end of the world, of course, but it was just kind of an interesting thing, I suppose, about the Smokies that I was unexpecting. That, I believe, was my first experience in the poop field. Just, keep that in mind, I guess. Get ready for the poop field. If you're up to date with privy science and the pros and cons of a poop field over a privy, I don't know, leave it down in the comments, let me know. So up out of Russell Field Shelter, we left, I think it was still pretty foggy and rainy that morning, but we got to mile 184.4, and the clouds and stuff had broke pretty well, and that was Rocky Bald, was it? Rocky Top, which had a kind of oddly named name in my opinion because it was pretty grassy. The view up there was pretty legit, so definitely enjoy the view up on top of Rocky Top. That night, we ended up staying at Siler's Bald Shelter. This shelter would unbeknowingly become our home that night and all day the next day. We got to the shelter that day. It was probably 5 o'clock-ish, and it was still sunny out. It looked like some weather was coming. I was considering pitching my tent, decided against it, was like, everyone's staying in the shelter, I'll stay in the shelter. Thank God I stayed in the shelter. It rained like I hadn't seen rain in probably my entire life that night, and all day the next day. We got into the shelter, all of us ended up staying in the shelter. It just poured, absolute downpours, rain blowing sideways. Luckily the shelters in the Smokies we passed on the AT, they all had tarps blocking like the actual whole entrance, so there was kind of just like a little doorway you could sneak in. And man, that rain was just pounding. This went on for legit all night that night, all through the next day, and it was just crazy. We debated, leaving. Thank God we didn't, because it was just a mess. We had probably 20 people jammed in that shelter. Luckily, there were some guys in that shelter who were pretty up on it and were like, we're gonna keep everybody warm. They kept going out in the woods, full poncho and rain gear, picking up firewood, and they would leave it under the overhang of the shelter, pull in some to dry, they'd put it in front of the fireplace to kind of dry it out, throw it on the fire, move some more, and they had a whole system going, so they kept everybody in the shelter warm. So good on you guys. I appreciate it. I appreciate it very much. But we talked to some people, there were people that were on the trail who came into the shelter hoping to stay, but there was no room. There was literally no room to put anyone. There were people sleeping on the dirt floor inside that ended up carrying on, and we talked to them after the fact, and they were saying that they were hiking on the trail in shin deep water. We talked to another group who ran into a Forest Service ranger where Klingman's Dome was, and he was like, "What are you guys doing up here?" And he let them get in the truck he had and drove everybody back down. I think that, we saw them in Gatlinburg, so that's where they ended up telling us that whole story. So absolutely crazy night staying at Siler's Bald up there. So luckily the shelter was there and we were able to stay safe up there. So water was super easy to find up there. There's a stream, 2 streams actually, past the shelter. So super easy to find. Another poop field here. So there were a few spots also to pitch a tent if you found that you needed to. So after we took our 0 day in the shelter, we left Siler's Bald to extremely wet and muddy trails. Some parts of the trails were still very stream-like, water just flowing right down them. And we made our way up Klingman's Dome that day, mile 199.4, which is the highest point on the Appalachian Trail. It was a little overcast, but still a pretty cool view up there. And with that said, we were coming down out of Klingman's Dome, and we got our way into Newfound Gap, and we all kind of met up there and made the decision that we would go down into town. And we were trying to avoid this. We resupplied and we're hoping to just get it right through the Smokies without having to get back down into town. Unfortunately, due to that unexpected 0 day, a couple of us were running low on food. So we just said, you know what, whatever, let's try to get down into Gatlinburg. We can resupply there, head back out the next day. Gatlinburg, technically, this video is for North Carolina. Gatlinburg is technically in Tennessee. In Newfound Gap is where you see the sign that says North Carolina-Tennessee border. I'm going to continue the North Carolina videos until Hot Springs, North Carolina. The trail from now on intersects back and forth between Tennessee and North Carolina. We ended up hitchhiking out of Newfound Gap. Our train only split into 2 groups because there were too many of us, who's going to pick up 6 people. And we ended up getting a ride from 2 traveling nurses, and they drove us down into Gatlinburg, which is approximately, I believe, a 15-mile drive from where we were. Gatlinburg's a weird place. Let me tell you, if you show up in the middle of Gatlinburg after being stuck in the woods for whatever it was, a month or so, it's gonna feel weird. Gatlinburg is a very tourist trappy kind of place. The nurses heard that 2 of us were from New England, so they insisted on dropping us off, or we insisted, at a Dunkin' Donuts in town there. So they dropped us off in the Dunkin' Donuts, which was kind of right in the middle of Gatlinburg. And I remember opened the door, got out of the car, went into the trunk to grab my bag, and I was just like, what is going on? It's sensory overload. Very, very touristy. So there's signs everywhere, there's music playing everywhere, there's loudspeakers trying to get people in. I think there was a Ripley's Believe It or Not place next door, so I was like, come mall. And mind you, I showed up to town in my Melanzana sweatshirt and a rain skirt. So like people are looking at us like, the hell? Like, and I felt so out of place and was just like, we need to find a spot like now. So we turned the corner back on the main street and we ended up just walking into the first inn that we saw. And it was, I think, called the Leconte View Inn. And we ended up getting a room there. So split between three of us, it wasn't too bad. I think it ended up being like $20-something each, something like that. The room there was pretty cool. It had a bathroom, 2 beds. The internet there was solid, so that was a nice little plus. I think it had a jacuzzi and pool too. They unfortunately did not have laundry here, so we had to do our laundry in the sink or the shower, and we used Dr. Bronner's and then just hung our clothes up wherever we could in the hotel, which, you know, was unfortunate, but whatever. It let us do our thing. As far as the rest of the town goes, it was expensive, like everywhere. It's a tourist town. Prices are steep, to say the least. We ended up going for food that night at the Mellow Mushroom Pizzeria. That place was phenomenal. I think we got 3 or 4 pizzas between us. Absolutely destroyed them. Had all sorts of beer too, so they did it by like the pitcher, which was great. A little pricey, but the food was phenomenal. So everybody kind of went around. I did not do much sightseeing around that town. I had no interest in going around that town. People were looking for places to resupply. I ended up just going to Walgreens. Literally just bought enough to get me by. And the prices at Walgreens too were pretty expensive, even for like the basic minimum stuff. It's definitely an expensive town. So if you get stuck there too, I've heard a lot of people get stuck in Gatlinburg. If the weather in the Smokies is bad, they'll close the road to go back up to the Smokies. And that can end up costing you a fortune, so be very wary of Gatlinburg. I mean, you could go around and enjoy the touristy things, but just not my cup of tea, I suppose. To get out of Gatlinburg, we tried to get a shuttle back. The NOC operates another outfitter in Gatlinburg, so there was a shuttle that's operated, I believe it was by a local church. We arrived on time, and as we were talking to the shuttle driver, a bunch of people who didn't arrive on time, we literally watched them run around like the side and sneak into the van while we were waiting. So yeah, real classy. Keep it classy, guys. The shuttle driver felt terrible, and like he was saying he'd come back, and like we were like, dude, we'll find a way. We headed back out to the road. We split up again, the main road, trying to get a ride back, and we were out there for a pretty long time trying to hitchhike. And I think a lot of people down there don't realize that it's the Appalachian Trail, so they're a bit weary picking up, you know, weird-looking hiker folk. Sitting there waiting, car finally pulls over, and I remember seeing Fudd go, oh my god! The people that picked us up were the same traveling nurses who dropped us off the day before. It's fate, man. It was crazy. Like, what are the odds? What are the odds of them driving by again right when we got back down there? So they drove us back up to Newfound Gap. They actually hiked with us for a while. They were trying to do the hike up to Charlie's Bunion, which is like the first cool view you come up to out of Newfound Gap. Apparently they drove by us. They didn't realize it was us at first. They drove by and we're like, oh my god, it's them! So I guess they drove up the road, turned around, and then came back and turned around to pick us up. So shout out to you guys if you ever happen to see this. It was awesome. The first thing you do pass, as I mentioned, would be Charlie's Bunion. We tried to go check it out. It's just a very small off trail, and it actually loops around too. It's supposedly an incredible view, but since it was so foggy, we did not see anything off of it, unfortunately. And this is where we said goodbye to our traveling friend nurses. We kind of hiked the whole way up the Bunion area with them. As far as other views, there were a couple that day. It did start to clear out a little bit after that, so just keep an eye, you know, off the trail. There's all sorts of little views to be had up there. And we made our way to mile 222, which is the Tri-Corner Knob Shelter. Again, this was a fairly small shelter. It did have another overhang. It did have a table from what I remember, and very easy access to water. Water is coming out of a rock pretty close to the shelter. There is a privy there as well. There were bare cables at that shelter from what I remember too, but very limited camping spots here. A bunch of people ended up pitching tents underneath the bare cables because there was nowhere else to go. I actually pitched on a little like slant that night. So at this spot, Big Mama caught some sort of stomach bug, probably Nora. She was puking like all that night. She, I think, stayed most of that day, the next day, and then was able to move on a little bit the next morning. So luckily she toughed it out, pushed through. And I remember leaving this area that there were some pretty cool viewpoints coming down out of there. So we ended up down at Davenport Gap, mile 237, and you are out of the Smokies. So we debated staying at Davenport Gap Shelter. Fun fact, it's one of the last shelters from what I read on the Appalachian Trail that still has chain link fence across it. Apparently chain link fence across shelters was very common, I believe back in, I think it was like the early 60s and 70s. And it was kind of like a way supposedly to deter bears from going into the shelter. However, I guess they started removing them because people were staying in the shelter and feeding bears through the chain link fence. Someone can fact check me on that. That is just what I heard. We were going to stay there, but opted not to. The shelter log had mentioned that people were throwing up in there all night the night before, so we quickly got right out of there and we just carried on. From there, we made our way toward Standing Bear Hostel. Fudd and I opted to stay at a stealth spot off of there, so it wasn't very far from Standing Bear, and we just stayed at that stealth spot. It worked out really good for me and him. Some of the other crew opted to actually stay at Standing Bear. We did not stay there, but we did pass through. You come down to a dirt road the next morning. If you go trail west or to your left and go up the road, that is where Standing Bear is. If you go down trail east to your right, that's where the trail continues. We did decide just to check it out in case any of the family was still up there. The guy Tape that we were hiking with was still up there, and this is where he informed us he was getting off of the trail. He just didn't like the crowdedness or whatever, didn't think it was for him, so we said our goodbyes to him there. The place was interesting. They had a pretty cool like little resupply option there. They kind of had like their own makeshift shed where they had all sorts of, goodies you could buy. The way they did it, you just took a piece of paper, wrote down everything. They had like a little basket or bag you could keep the stuff in. You just check in with the the guy that was running the place, pay, and you'd be good to go. It was a little pricey, but whatever. You don't have to get to a grocery store. Even if you're just trying to get a couple things here and there to keep you going, you can definitely check out the option at Standing Bear. I heard prices were pretty reasonable. The bunk room seemed pretty legit. They did have Wi-Fi there, but it was a little iffy from when we were using it. We just hung out there a little bit that morning talking to the guy Tape and eating some snacks we bought in the resupply spot. So yeah, I can't really tell you neither here nor there exactly how this day was. So after leaving Standing Bear, we went back down and you come to highway overpass. So you pass right under the highway. It's Interstate 40. The climb out of that area, I recall, wasn't too bad. It seemed like a nice gradual elevation and you end up going over Snowbird Mountain. Solid view up there too, so definitely keep an eye out for that. Camped on top of Max Patch this night. Max Patch was unreal. So I hear differentiating things about this. According to the guidebook, you can stay up here. It does not say that there's no camping. It specifically states no fires. I also did not see on the entire Appalachian Trail anywhere along the way no camping on top of Max Patch. So no signs posted anywhere. We talked to locals who didn't seem to think that there was any sort of issue up there, but I had one extremely rude person leave a comment on the video I posted about that, threatening to murder me or something along those lines because we camped up there. I do not know. So if you do know the actual regulations, perhaps you can leave them politely in the comments. So I'm not going to recommend staying up there. I'm not going to recommend staying up there because I don't know if it's actually something you're allowed to do or not. All the locals seemed completely cool with it. There were a ton of people up there talking to us, taking pictures, photographing the sunset. So yeah, use your own discretion and try to find out the rules. According to the guidebook, there was no whatever against it. And Gut Hook too, the actual app, apparently there was nothing listed about no camping up there either. So with that said, staying up there was one of my favorite days and nights on the trail. So there were about, I think 10 of us that pitched our tents on top of there. It was kind of cloudy and crappy all day, but it got super clear out during that time. And we watched a pretty beautiful sunset and just taking in the view on Max Patch. It's just unreal up there. Phenomenal views on top of Max Patch. That night, it did get pretty foggy and windy overnight, but when we woke up the next morning, man, dude, one of the best mornings on the trail. Everybody was just chilling. Like, we all pitched our tents opening to the east so that we could check out the sunrise, and I just opened my thing. Man, dude, it was so cool. Unreal. I don't think I'll be able to put to words what it was like to just kick it there, and looked out of my tent, and Spitfire, I think, was the one right next to me, and Fudd was behind her. So we were all on a road just kind of looking at each other like, man, this is awesome. One of the best days / mornings of the trail. However, it very quickly turned into my worst day on the trail. So just like that. We left Max Patch that morning, and It hit me like a ton of bricks. We got to what I believe was Walnut Mountain Shelter. So we stopped there for lunch. I felt great that morning, and by the time we got there, I felt like absolute crap. I think it was 7 miles that we made it. I had no energy whatsoever. And like, I just felt bad. I tried to nap in the actual shelter to try to feel a little bit better, and it worked a little bit. I felt a little bit better. You know, I drank water. I tried to eat, but I like could not eat at all. Could not force myself to eat. So everybody was like, yo, are you all right? And I was like, yeah, you guys should just keep going. Like, I'll catch up to you. Don't worry about it. Whole trail family went on. I should have bitched my tent and stayed at that shelter. I should have got out of the shelter and stayed on the trail somewhere. I decided, however, I can push on. It won't be a problem. Absolute terrible decision. I made it, I think, 3/4 to a mile. It took me over an hour to make it that far. I almost passed out a few times. I would go maybe a couple 100 feet. I'd have to sit down and like regain my composure. I kept going, and eventually I found another water source after that shelter. And once I found that water source, I refilled all my stuff, pitched my tent literally on a hill. My tent was like this on the side of a hill, and I put all my clothing and stuff on the bottom so I would kind of not fly down through my tent. And I passed out like in my tent that night. I just slept the rest of that day, and then into the next morning. Felt like absolute death. I didn't throw up. My stomach did not feel right. I didn't throw up at all though, but something was not right. So I woke up the next morning, had a little bit more energy. I felt a little bit better. I still couldn't really eat. The only thing I could eat, I had ramen, a couple Starbursts, and some peanut butter and crackers. So I peeled the peanut butter off the crackers and ate a couple crackers and I think half a granola bar. It was enough to kind of get me up and going. I packed up all my stuff and pushed on, and I ended up making it 11 miles down into Hot Springs, North Carolina. And again, I felt like absolute garbage. Like, I remember very specifically, like, that is one of the most trying times I think I had on the trail. I don't think it was dehydration. I drink water like crazy on the trail. So I think maybe I caught some form of whatever Big Mama had, but it's hard to tell. I hadn't talked to anybody else from the trail family yet. So I made it 11 miles down into Hot Springs. I just remember walking on the trail, and that was like the longest day ever. I stopped at another shelter on the way to Hot Springs, the shelter that everybody was staying at that night before. I sat down on a log, I refilled water there again. I was just like, oh my God, I feel like crap. I thought about staying there that night, but I opted to push it, and luckily this time I found enough energy to actually make it to Hot Springs. I made it down, and I just remember like walking down the trail into Hot Springs. The video of me is just like, I made it. And Fudd took a great picture of me, because I got down to Hot Springs, and right when you come out at Hot Springs on your left, Trail West, will be Laughing Heart Hostel. So they were all there, the trail family. Big Mama was still behind because she had waited at the other shelter because she was feeling bad. So she was supposed to get to Laughing Heart that day. But all the rest of them were sitting on a table outside Laughing Heart Hostel. They were like, oh my God, you're all right? And I was like, oh. And Fudd took a great picture of me. I'll try to find it. And I was just done. And I told them what happened, and they were like, oh dude, us too. I was like, what do you mean us too? They're like, we're all sick. I was like, you gotta be kidding me. So apparently they made it that night to the shelter I stopped at that day to like just take a rest. And I guess Spitfire woke up right in the middle of the night, got out of her tent, puked everywhere. The Wisconsin guys both got sick. Fudd was feeling exactly like I was. So I wonder if, or me and him got noro before, maybe we were like moderately immune. I have no explanation. But he didn't puke, and he felt much better too. So like I felt pretty good, you know, and he felt good that next day. But everybody else was just out for the count, so everybody got sick again. Another thing, you know, sickness is out there. Try to be careful, you know, as far as like washing hands, sharing food with each other. Hand sanitizer, from what I was told, will not kill norovirus. So just try to be cleanly as you can out there, because getting sick out there sucks. It is terrible. I ended up staying in the bunk room at Laughing Heart Hostel. It worked out. Fudd and the Wisconsin guys, I believe, all stayed outside. You could tent like outside and pay a cheaper price. Big Mama shared a room with 2 other guys, Torch and Medicine Man. And maybe Spitfire had a private room. So we were all kind of in the hostel, but not together. But the place was cool, very chill. The guy who ran it was just very relaxed, easygoing kind of dude. That night we ended up going down to Spring Creek Tavern to eat, and it was pretty packed. Definitely a ton of people there. The service, unfortunately, was kind of meh. The food was kind of meh as well, and it took forever to get food, so I think we waited an hour for our food to come out, and they weren't very whatever about it. They were just like, yeah, sorry, deal with it. And I think in the actual menu, on the front page of the menu, it says, if you're in a rush, don't eat here. I don't know. It was a little strange. I'm not going to recommend it. I'm not going to recommend it. So just know if you go there, it's probably going to take a while. And yeah, that's all I got. We went back to the hostel that night. We just chilled there. Kept it low key. You know, all of us were still feeling kind of iffy. So the next day when we woke up, we hung out at the hostel too. The guy was cool, you know, as far as hanging out there. He was just like, yeah, if you guys can just, you know, leave the room so I can clean stuff up. He's like, you guys can hang out here all day. So we were just hanging out on the lawn, and we ended up getting the same tavern, the Spring Creek Tavern. Whoever I think it's the same people that own the place. Just upstairs from them, they offer rooms. I think they had 3 available. And we ended up getting one of the rooms, and our entire trail family decided to spend the day here. We were like, we all feel like garbage. Like, let's, you know, we're feeling good today. Let's take one more day. We'll take a 0. We'll kind of enjoy the town a little bit because we couldn't yesterday. And now we'll head back to the trail the next day. So that's what we did. And this place was legit. So we paid, I think it was $120 total, and 6 of us stayed there. So whatever the total was, it was under 20 bucks each that we paid to stay there. The section we stayed in, it had everything you need except the kitchen, so there was no actual kitchen there. You go upstairs, and then right behind the actual stairway is where our area was, and you walk in. To your right, there's a bathroom and a smaller room. That's where Spitfire and Big Mammy stayed. And then there was a bigger room right in front with 2 beds, and that's where the Wisconsin guys, me and Fudd, stayed. And it was just nice, beautiful, well taken care of area. Really, really enjoyed it. So definitely take a look into that. I think it's a better option than staying at the hostel. I, again, prefer having my own little space with people I know, if I can, than staying at a hostel. Like, I'd rather split a hotel or a room like that anytime. And this day is when we definitely branched out more, took a look around the town. First off, that morning when we were actually heading down to that room, we ended up going to the breakfast spot in town, which is the Smoky Mountain Diner. And that place was bomb. They had pancakes with apple and cinnamon on top. I tried to split them with anybody that would eat them, and like, nobody could finish it. It was just unfinishable. Delicious, but just too much. Good food there, good people. The waitress, I remember, was very, very friendly. So she had that southern charm, I guess you could call it. We ate there in the morning. I opted to do some resupply after that as well. I went to, there's a Dollar General almost right next to the Smoky Mountain Diner. And next to Dollar General, there's a place called the Hillbilly Market or something like that. I did all of my resupply at the Dollar General. I heard that the Hillbilly Market had some things that Dollar General did not, some more actual like grocer type things. And those two are right next to each other, so you have a great option as far as resupply goes. The entire town of Hot Springs, maybe in general or just on the AT, is one street, has literally everything you need. Once you pass the Dollar General and that, you're going down toward the Tavern. On your left, right before the Tavern, is the post office. It is worth mentioning the post office, I feel like on one of the days we went, had kind of weird hours. If you need to drop something off or you're trying to pick up a package, try to time that appropriately. You know, make sure that you're in the allotted time frame that the post office is open. The post office is there, then the Tavern is like almost right next door to that, and then right above it is the room that we stayed in. Directly across from the Tavern is Bluff Mountain Outfitters. They had a solid selection of gear, essentially anything you really need for the Appalachian Trail they carried. Further down that street a little bit, a couple buildings away, there was a laundry spot. You can get laundry done at Laughing Heart. We did our laundry, and it smelled worse after we took it out. I don't think that's anything wrong with their washing machine. The guy gave us Tide Pods to use, and I think we only put 1 in for 3 people's laundry, and it just smelled terrible, so we messed up. So we all opted to throw our laundry back in at the little laundromat there, and it came out good. It came out great. So I definitely would recommend maybe not using 1 Tide Pod for 3 people's things of laundry. There's also another restaurant, bar area across that area too. I think it's called Iron Horse Station. I think that's what it's called. So I heard great things about that. One of the biggest issues I think with Hot Springs, it's a great town, don't get me wrong, but a lot of people I feel like ended up getting off here. I think a lot of people hit that first town, and where it's a trail town, you don't really need to go anywhere to get, you know, the necessities or the niceties of normal life. And I think a lot of people, when they found that again, kind of got deterred from, the entire goal, or their entire goal of the Appalachian Trail. I think they found the easy life again, if you would call it that, and kind of got sucked back into wanting to be back in regular life. So be aware, you can get caught up in town like that, and Hot Springs was definitely one that I think really sucked some people out. A bunch of people that I can think of that got off the trail literally told us that while we were hanging out with them in Hot Springs, they're like, "Oh yeah, I'm done." We're like, "What?" And like, "Yeah, I've been here for like 3 days now. I'm not really feeling the trail. This is better." It is worth mentioning too, there are other places you can stay in Hot Springs. Those are just the two that we stayed at. If you're on a like a penny pincher kind of budget, if you keep going through Hot Springs and you go, there's a bridge, it goes over whatever the French Broad River. You'll go over the bridge, over the French Broad River, and then the trail turns back and it goes up the side of that river. There are all sorts of camping spots right there along that river. So just keep that in mind if you're looking for a spot close enough to town, but where you don't have to pay anything to stay there. I don't know the legality of these places, but it seems everybody in the town is well aware of them, and nobody seems to really care. And when we passed there the next morning when we left, all sorts of people stayed there. So that is where I'm going to cut it for North Carolina. Technically, the trail weaves back and forth between Tennessee and North Carolina for a little bit, but I'm going to continue this portion on in the Tennessee video. So that's going to wrap it up for North Carolina. So my overall thoughts on North Carolina. At that point on the trail, I was feeling pretty good. Wasn't too pleased that I got sick again, but luckily that was one of the only times from there on out that I would get sick. I did end up getting a cold again in New Hampshire, but overall, health-wise, after that initial second bout with random sickness, I did feel much better. I felt that my body was getting more and more accustomed to the beating that the trail would put on you. The aches and stuff were still there, the muscle aches, the little bit of joint aches, but they were getting easier and easier to deal with as your body gets more and more accustomed to that lifestyle. I feel like the trail itself in North Carolina seemed a bit more rustic and rooty, I suppose, than it did in Georgia. And while we were in North Carolina, that's when we kind of started to see the green start to pop out a little more, walking into springtime. So definitely worth mentioning. It did feel a little bit more rustic. Some of the climbs, I think, were a little more challenging than most of Georgia was. Smokies were pretty cool. I don't think they were great, and I don't think they were terrible. We passed through in fairly bad weather for most of the time we were in there, but we still got some decent views and stuff, and I thought they were all right. Gatlinburg is one of the weirdest towns I've ever been in my life. If you can avoid Gatlinburg, definitely avoid Gatlinburg. I thoroughly enjoyed both Franklin and Hot Springs. Both the towns were pretty cool. Very, very nice people. So I think that is going to wrap it up, everyone. We'll cut it right there. So next video will be in Tennessee, even though I may still mention some spots that are technically in North Carolina. But again, the trail zigzags back and forth for a little bit between North Carolina and Tennessee. So hope the video was helpful. And if it was, please consider dropping it a like. If you loved it, consider dropping a comment down below and subscribing. I'm basing how quickly I turn these around based on how the feedback is received. So please, if you enjoyed, like or drop a comment down below. Super, super appreciate it. You can follow me on Instagram at Chris Goes Outdoors if you care to. Got all sorts of videos planned and on the way, so definitely hit that subscribe button if you enjoyed. Hope this video was helpful for you out on the Appalachian Trail, planning your through hike, your next through hike, your section hike, your random hike. And until next time, we'll catch you in the next one. Take care.